All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk about the anti-satellite test of China that occurred in 2007. My name is Andrea Mosilla. I'm a doctoral student in global security with the American Public University. And we have here today with us Dr. James Birch, who is the department chair of the intelligence studies, as well as a professor with the School of Security and Global Studies. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and let us get started. So spacefaring has emerged as a critical element of global security as well as strategic intelligence, as it plays a significant role in all elements of national power, diplomacy, information, military, and economics. China's 2007 anti-satellite test ushered a new era in spacefaring when China conducted a devastating direct ascent ASAT test against a weather satellite in orbit, a test that resulted in over 3,000 pieces of space debris in low Earth orbit. The unexpected nature of this test caught the international spacefaring community off guard, and led to a significant diplomatic, informational, military, and economic implication. The test gave rise to immediate concerns among spacefaring powers, prompting questions about China's intentions. The United States and China have been competitors in space for decades. However, China's recent advancement in space and acts of aggression like this ASAT test have additionally raised concerns with the spacefaring community. The ASAT test and other potential disrupting activities also present a warning to the intelligence community, as many of these activities span across all these elements of national power. Our presentation today will assess the significance of China's 2007 ASAT test through the lens of the diplomatic, informational, economic, and military components, with the scope to shed a light on its implications on global security and also propose a set of intelligence recommendations intended to prevent strategic surprises in the future. I will address the global security component, and Dr. Birch will address the strategic intelligence component.
Hey, Andrea, and I would just like to emphasize that what you just said is very on the spot. While the intelligence community had some pre-launch understanding and was able to assess movements and kind of low-level things, they had no insight into the actual intentions. And when it happened, it really did come as a surprise. So this is a pretty significant case for those of us in the community. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Birch. The theoretical framework that we used for this presentation is grounded in the work of Shihan 2007 on the international politics of space and the application of idealism and realism to spacefaring, as well as Space 2023 on the application of realism to space activity and space policy. Shihan claims that idealism and realism clash in explaining why states engage in space activities. And on the surface, idealism appears to be the reason humanity has ventured into space. However, as we all know, at its dawn, spacefaring was used as a tool to win the Cold War, justifying as such the realist perspective that states struggle for power and national advantage. So while Shihan applies realism to the space race during the Cold War, this theoretical framework does apply well to the current spacefaring competition with China, because China claims that its development of ASAT technology is a response to space capabilities displayed by its adversary, the United States, and a means to defend itself from the United States. According to Pace, since realism claims that states focus on their own power and interest is what causes anarchy on the global stage, this competition for power is a reasonable justification for the space security dilemma. The space security dilemma refers to the idea that space competition between states is conducted with the state's interest in mind, but at the same time, the consequences are global. So China's interest in developing counter space systems, including anti-satellite technology, is a very good example for the realist perspective, as China's main reason is this fear that the United States could use its power in space to prevent it from becoming a spacefaring powerhouse itself, and also with the ultimate goal of actually deterring China from becoming from developing its nuclear arsenal in space. And as realism states, claims China's development of ASAT technology is actually the expected reaction of a state in need to protect its national security and national interest. So spacefaring plays a significant role in global leadership because it displays power. Since 1957, when the space era began with Sputnik, spacefaring nations have been competing for global hegemony and prestige, and use space endeavors to demonstrate their influence on the international stage. The strategic motivation is that spacefaring is a form of soft power, but it can also be used as hard power. The idea of soft power was popularized by Joseph Nye in late 80s, and the concept actually refers to the ability of influencing behavior through persuasion while achieving a state's policy goals. It can also be defined as using other means than the military to display force on the global stage in a non-coercive manner. On the other side, the hard power refers to using the national elements of power, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic to show strength or employ coercion to compel behavior and compliance. So far, as we all know, spacefaring activities have been primarily used as a soft power. Still, despite international treaties banning the national appropriation or militarization of space, the use of space for coercive purposes remains an attractive endeavor for those states that can afford spacefaring. While ASAT weapons have yet to be used in a warfare situation, testing such weapons has generated havoc in the spacefaring community. And while the United States and China have been competitors in space for decades, in recent years, however, China has accelerated the development of its space program, and it now aims to land the first Chinese person on the moon by 2030, in competition with NASA's current Artemis program that seeks to return astronauts to the lunar surface by 2025. The DIME, the diplomatic, information, military, and economic components play a significant role in the spacefaring dynamics between nations. The first two spacefaring nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, used space capabilities to display power and as a diplomatic tool as well to solidify and maintain superpower status and eventually win the Cold War. The space program was also an incredible economic accomplishment generated by the development of new technology, as well as a source of informational exchange between allies, as space agency developed collaboration and exchanged scientific and technological information. While on the diplomatic side, spacefaring nations advocated for international treaties that would regulate space activities and ban weaponization. Space militarization has actually developed exponentially in the shadow of the civil space program with a national security purpose and a display of power on the global stage. There is no doubt that spacefaring had military purposes from the beginning of the space age, actually. Space diplomacy involves the cooperation between states to develop and strengthen the peaceful use of outer space. Space diplomacy was really trendy during the 60s and the 70s when this activity was a novel activity. The United States used to lead the diplomatic attempts to create a set of international laws that would offer a legal framework for space activities. And these attempts resulted in several bilateral agreements as well as international treaties. However, since the 90s, the United States has resisted participating in space diplomacy, but in the wake of the China's 2007 ASAT test, and because of the newly emerging issues in orbit generated by such activities, the United States has recently re-entered the field of space diplomacy. The diplomatic purpose of an ASAT test is to coerce an adversary state to agree to a treaty or an international law about space activities, in this case, banning weapons in space. So a critical diplomatic reason behind this specific China ASAT test was to force adversary states to come to the negotiation table to implement an international treaty or agreement that would limit or even prohibit space weaponization, including ASAT weapons. At that time, Russia and China have been in favor of the United Nations General Assembly's annual resolution on the prevention of the arms race in outer space, known as PAROS. However, the United States first abstained and then finally opposed PAROS in 2006, and therefore China's 2007 ASAT test was a policy weapon aimed at forcing the United States to accept the resolution. Unfortunately, the idea that diplomatic efforts in space would lead to treaties and international laws regulating future space activities will not work as well as long as spacefaring moves faster and technology moves faster than lawmaking. Instead, it appears that it is expected that as events in space unfold, these events themselves will shape lawmaking and result in new international space policies. China's ASAT test is an example of an event that will eventually lead to future diplomatic attempts and space laws. And I will let Dr. Birch take over and discuss the strategic intelligence diplomatic implications.
Hey, thank you, Andrea. You know, to the point that's being made, and one of the reasons why we focused on this event is that really China's ASAT launch was the first of its kind. As Andrea, you know, set the case for us, the United States had ceased to engage aggressively in diplomatic efforts over the past several decades. Recently, the Biden administration has published its strategic framework for space diplomacy. It'll be interesting to see where that's kind of a reinitiation or a foray into this effort to kind of normalize diplomatic efforts. The implications for Intel, going back to this case, and Andrea alluded to that as she led us off, is that really there was little to no diplomatic messaging prior to the event. So one of the points that was emphasized was during the Cold War, you saw a lot of posturing and a lot of the use of space as a national instrument of power and a demonstration of strength. Whether it was on the side of the Soviet Union or the United States, you saw that used significantly in messaging one another's adversaries. In this case, there was none of that. Like I mentioned earlier, there were very low level. You could see things, some movement on the ground from what we've been able to glean and through open sources. There were some indications that there was some activity going on, but nothing on the diplomatic side. And interestingly enough, every indication was that within the Chinese government, the information and the decision to launch was restricted very narrowly or compartmentalized within their national command authority and its military. So the Chinese foreign ministry in this case wasn't involved or didn't have any prior knowledge to the launch. After the launch, there was very little messaging or even acknowledgement on the part of the Chinese government as well. So from a warning analysis and this perspective, it's very difficult to place this event within the idea of strategic intent. We can think, or we can assess that maybe this launch was a reaction to U.S. reluctance to engage in the treaty deliberations, but that were occurring beforehand. But it's very difficult to describe that with any level of precision, and that's why, whether from a global security perspective or an intel perspective, this case merits a little bit closer of a look. Andrea, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Birch. So we're going to move on to information, which is a perfect bridge from what you just spoke about. Spacefaring is a vast source of information and intelligence. Information sharing primarily occurs between allies. A space-related example would be the ongoing international cooperation on the International Space Station, and also several joint space missions between allies that involves NASA, ESA, JAXA, and other national space agencies. However, there is no denying that collecting intelligence from space is essential for spacefaring nations. The United States is currently the most significant intelligence collector from space, using a vast constellation of surveillance and reconnaissance satellites in low Earth and geosynchronous orbits, including signal intelligence satellites, infrared, radar, and optical imaging satellites. The development of the Chinese ASAT technology presents a near-term risk to the U.S. intelligence satellites, such as direct ascent and direct energy attacks to the low Earth orbit satellites, but also a long-term risk that would include co-orbital attacks. China's progress in ASAT technology represents a serious threat to information and intelligence collection. This development renders China's space activity more threatening to the United States space endeavors than the Soviet Union used to be at its peak in spacefaring. A significant reason behind the ASAT test was that China is actually not dependent on space satellites to collect intelligence as much as the United States is. And therefore, the space debris generated by this ASAT test and its severe threat to reconnaissance and surveillance satellites was not as much a problem for China as it was for the United States. Another information aspect that Dr. Birch has discussed already is actually that China has failed to inform the international community about this ASAT test, and actually not even the Chinese media advertised the endeavor before or after, right after. The information on the test actually came from the American intelligence community, primarily the U.S. Air Force Space Command radars that monitor the orbit before and after the test. To counter China's new ASAT capabilities, the United States had to demonstrate information superiority by reforming space intelligence. So, Dr. Birch, back to you for the strategic intelligence information implication.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. One of the things that I believe that we have to consider when it comes to the space domain is we have a predisposition to put things into their own boxes, and we look at the space domain as just that. It's the space domain as opposed to like maritime or ground or air. But really, when you think about space, it is so interconnected, and it is such an enabler for lots of the other things that we do, whether it's in the military or intelligence, or even in a modern society with our conveniences. So whether we're talking about the use of GPS to enable precision navigation, as an example, has extensive commercial and economic uses. What China has done, the point I'm trying to make here is that what China has done is that they have since they developed their architecture basically from the ground up within a short span of time, they have ensured safeguards and redundancies in the way they manage their underlying information infrastructure. So they recognize that the United States is extremely dependent on the space domain for not only the intelligence gathering capabilities that Andrea referred to, but also for our economic well-being. Less so with China, because they do have those redundancies. So much like in the Cold War, you had this idea of survivability and mutually assured destruction and deterrence and all those kinds of things. Historically, the United States has presumed a space hegemony. We've just assumed that we've held the high ground, and now with lowering costs of technology, improvements in technical capacities across the globe, and not just China and Russia, but you have lots of other spacefaring nations as well. This hegemonic presumption is an illusion that doesn't really exist. So the strategic intel implication here is that when it comes to information, if China felt that they were less dependent on the space domain and that they were able to maintain their information flow and their capacity and be able to continue to function, that might be a pretty significant implication for the intel community and China's predisposition to launch another test or demonstration like they've done before. So this is definitely an area that in terms of intel analysis and categorizing this issue, this is definitely an area for growth on the part of our community. Andrea, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Birch. Let's move to the military aspect of this. Even if an open space conflict has never occurred so far, the military aspect of spacefaring remains a pretty significant component that we cannot neglect. The military purpose of an ASAT test is obviously to demonstrate capability. As a nation capable of an ASAT test can disrupt essential functions in an adversary country, including communication, navigation, and phone or banking services, as well as threaten military capabilities, intelligence gathering, as we discussed already, and military operations driven from space. While space has been militarized for decades, a space conflict has never occurred, and space weaponization remains an international topic of concern. Anti-satellite tests are the first endeavors of more of a military nature than exploration because they aim to destroy space targets. A significant component of the military aspect of spacefaring inhabits the different orbits of Earth in the form of military satellites, which we discussed already, and that have significant strategic objectives. Anti-satellite tests are a space debris issue as well, and a strategic military issue, making space the ultimate war-fighting domain. A critical reason, a military reason behind China's 2007 ASAT test was a reaction to the strengthening of strategic links between the United States, Taiwan, and India. At that time, China worried as the United States and India signed a nuclear deal and a new strategic partnership. When the United States aimed to contain China, and offered to assist Taiwan, China just demonstrated its space capability to counter these new developments. And in doing so, they became the third spacefaring nation capable of testing anti-satellite weapons in space. after the US and Russia. It showed the world China's military capabilities had reached a new level, generating international concern that deploying offensive weapons in space might be next. This ASAT test clearly indicates that Chinese space program is militarized and weaponized, despite China's space diplomacy strategy to position itself against space weaponization and as a competitive response to its adversary, the United States. The test was a decisive moment in space weaponization, as at the very least, it generated a new discourse on the topic. And for the strategic intelligence military implications, I will let Dr. Birch take over. Dr. Birch.
Thank you, Andrea. We've discussed some of this up to this point in that the original launch back in 2007 was basically did take us by surprise, and with very little messaging to kind of give us an understanding of what was some of the strategic analysis on the part of China. Those gaps in our knowledge remain with us today. We're further challenged by the fact that the complexity of the problem has increased. There's a lot of things that have changed, obviously, since 15 plus years ago. So the space is more interconnected to the other domains than ever. It is not a silo that exists on its own. Much like the US and our allies, China does require the use of space for its military. Although, like I mentioned earlier, they do have significant more redundancies than we do. So our level of dependence is much more exposed to the use of space. So from a military perspective, as we look in the intel community, really what's the strategic doctrine? What's the intent on the part of China to engage and to use some of these weapons that are part of the counter space continuum as part of their military doctrine, right? And we're not talking about just an ASAT launch. We could be talking about things like the use of lasers, the electronic warfare, the integrated use of cyber to disable space networks or satellite space networks. Where does all this fit in terms of Chinese decision making and their decision, let's say, to go more towards an open conflict? And we can think through a lot of the things that we see today and trying to assess Chinese intent to reintegrate Taiwan as an example. And then the other implication here is, well, what's the level of threat in referred to the counter space continuum is there are reversible versus irreversible effects. One to conduct electronic warfare or the use of a laser to basically spoof one of our imaging satellites, as an example. That can be a reversible effect. That's a temporary. How does that messaging? How does the use of those capabilities? What are they trying to tell us, right? When we start talking about ASAT launches and an actual missile going up into space, well, now we're talking irreversible effects. Where does that fit in, and how does the use of these weapons fit within our broader understanding of Chinese intent? I think is going to be the key issue for future intelligence analysis as we try and think through this issue as a broader warning problem. Andrea, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Birch. So we're going to move on to the last component, economy. Space economy includes all space activities, basically, that are valued to us, to humans, and it has several different sectors, from manufacturing and launch to infrastructure operations, but also activities that derive from space endeavors, such as technology transfer from space activities to other human endeavors, including medical or finance, for example. While the United States remains more economically dependent on space than China, China is yet to depend economically on spacefaring, and this is actually a significant reason why it remains a big advocate for space arms control. Economic dependence would mean that the United States space counteroffensive would result in a sufficient damage to China that space arms control would become insignificant to them at that point. In the wake of the 2007 ASAT test, the United States did not consider economic sanctions against China, perhaps because the history of such sanctions against China did not render good results. Instead, the path chosen was to continue improving space operations and innovation, because it is the innovation that runs the US economic engine. The United States remains the largest investor in space at the moment, while China is in 8th place in share of the GDP invested in the space budget. The United States' economic interest in space is obviously significantly higher than that of China's. And therefore, the issue of space debris generated by this ASAT test is and was a significant economic consequence to the United States, given the importance of an operational space orbit actually to many industries, from communication to navigation to finance, healthcare, and even entertainment. Any activity that generates additional space debris in orbit can lead to significant disruptions on Earth. Dr. Birch, back to you for the strategic intelligence economic implications.
Hey, thank you so much, Andrea. When we start talking about economics, and this is probably the one area that I probably have the most to learn. I'm just as I've worked with Andrea over these past couple of months on this project, I'm kind of fascinated at the impact of the space economy itself. Kind of lacking a prior appreciation for this. We're talking about a pretty significant magnitude. If you look at the Bureau of Economic Analysis under the Commerce Department, for example, we're talking about something close to the level of about $500 billion, so almost $500 billion. There's probably 360,000 people here in the United States alone involved in space economic efforts, whether through manufacturing, etc. This is a thing, right? And I think one of my concerns as an Intel professional, and as we look at this, and this is not just relating to the space domain, but as we pointed out, the space domain is incredibly inextricably linked with everything else that we do as a modern society. It is the basis for a lot of the innovative things that whether it's our research labs, our universities are engaging in, and it really requires a high level of sophistication in terms of manufacturing and producing satellites and networks and launch vehicles that send you out into outer space. So like I like to say is that, you know, we're not talking about working on Jim Birch's Forerunner out in the garage. We're talking about really having to harden and to come up with new technologies that's going to enable future space exploration and eventually get to places like Mars, etc. That's a significant R&D investment, and it requires access to lots of things that bleed over into rare earth minerals and that sort of thing. So we really do need to understand the intricacies of securing and not only securing, but understanding what the supply chain is. That is not as well appreciated, I think, as we would like. As we saw in our reaction to the pandemic and to shortfalls in manufacturing and computer chips and everything else, that you saw shortages manifest itself with that. That in and of itself can be used as a weapon to inhibit U.S. and allied efforts to further develop our space economy. Present. So there's another level of analysis that needs to occur when we talk about the economic aspect of national power and the implications for our intelligence community. Andrea, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Birch. We're going to move on to the significance to global security. The importance of spacefaring to global security obviously cannot be overstated for several reasons. First, space capabilities are integral to various aspects of national security, including communication, surveillance, and navigation systems, as we already discussed extensively. All of these relying on satellites. If a country possesses the capability to disable or even destroy these satellites through anti-satellite weapons, it gains a significant advantage, potentially even crippling the adversary. Secondly, the accumulation of space debris already discussed here, resulting from space activities like an ASAT test, presents a universal threat. This debris can damage or destroy satellites and spacecraft, irrespective of national ownership, and impairing critical systems for multiple countries. This would have dire consequences for global communication, navigation, surveillance capabilities. Thirdly, the competition between countries in space exploration, exemplified by the United States and China, adds another layer of geopolitical tension. This competition is about prestige and gaining a strategic foothold, whether close to Earth or on other celestial bodies like the moon. And lastly, the current inadequacy of international space law in dealing with these challenges leaves many issues unresolved, creating ambiguity that could lead to conflicts. The existing treaties are not sufficient to handle the complexity and potential confrontations arising from advanced space activities. Therefore, the situation demands a comprehensive international approach to establish new norms and rules, the failure of which could imperil global security significantly. And Dr. Birch, if you could take over and discuss the ASAT test significance for strategic intelligence, I will move the slide over for you.
Thank you so much. It's as you've heard us talk here in the last several minutes, we as a modern society and emerging markets, I mean, we are hugely dependent on space for everything that we do. I'm not just talking about intelligence, I'm talking about everything. So the use of imaging satellites, AI-enabled technologies to increase crop yields, for example, for agriculture is a thing. You've heard me talk about the presumed space hegemony that the United States has enjoyed over the past several decades. That obviously is no longer guaranteed, which makes this a very interesting case to evaluate. And then, like I mentioned, there's a lot of things that have changed since 2007. So we need to basically understand those implications and then advance them into what our understanding of the environment is today. The space domain is highly complex. It is integrated into everything that we do. Andrea mentioned that there's never been a confrontation in space, and there hasn't. But I would also like to point out that we're really not at peace either. We're in competition with lots of lots of, whether it's China or Russia, there's competition all over the global environment. So this is not a traditional warning problem like we would see in the Cold War, where we were counting tanks and ships and the number of missiles and everything else. This is really a gray zone problem. There's lots of literature out there on what it is to operate in the gray zone between actual conflict and those activities that are less than a conflict, right? So understanding the implications of these issues really does challenge whether it's intelligence collection or ability to plan for future scenarios, analyze these events. And we need to really think through the complexity of this problem. To further compound the issue, this is also a very technical area that requires specialization. So our general military analysis that we've used to, let's say, assess the capabilities of an adversary's Navy or Air Force, it's different when you start talking about space. So to echo what Andrea said, it does require not only a holistic assessment of space from a global security aspect, but it also requires a holistic assessment of space from an intelligence perspective as we frame this warning problem so that we could better advise our nation's policymakers. Unlike the Cold War and maybe traditional approaches for intel professionals, we've been very comfortable to operate on our own, right? We've been very comfortable in operating with a very defined set of allies. Everybody knows what the Five Eyes community is. And that's kind of the traditional bedrock of what our allied cooperation. But as we have seen, even with events, as we've witnessed Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, the intelligence community has had to operate and to collaborate with a much wider group of partners than just the Five Eyes community, and even more so than just NATO. So we're talking about engaging not only with other nation states, but we need to have a better job in collaborating with the space industry, the actual industry itself, and then also with academia and the research labs that bring these concepts together. This will give us a better understanding of what some of those alternative scenarios and maybe give us insights into what the overall Chinese intent is on that counter space continuum and the use of these capabilities and these weapons. By collaborating with a broader group of organizations and individuals, I think would only lead us to better optimize our red teaming efforts, to understand those scenarios, and really to posture the intel community to better advise the key decision makers that we need to inform. And that's where I would stop as far as issues that I see facing the community.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Birch. I'm going to conclude. China's January 11, 2007 ASAT test surprised the Spacefaring international community and had a significant diplomatic, informational, military, and economic consequence. The diplomatic purpose of an ASAT test is to coerce an adversary to agree to a treaty or an international law about space activities, in this case, banning weapons in space. Information-wise, a significant reason behind this ASAT test was that China is not dependent on space satellites to collect intelligence as much as the United States. Thirdly, the military purpose of an ISAT test is to demonstrate capability. So this test showed the world that China's military capabilities had reached a new level, and generating international concern that deploying offensive weapons in space might be next. And finally, China is yet to depend economically on spacefaring, a significant reason why it remains a big advocate for space arms control, while the United States remains more economically dependent on space than China. Dr. Birch, would you like to add anything to the conclusion?
I think to the point that the underlying point that we've been trying to make is that this problem, really understanding this problem and its linkages to kind of how we look at the world really requires a new level of analysis and a new level of thinking. This is very much for my lane in the road as an Intel professional. This is very much having to operate and understand within that gray zone that that I was referring to, and that makes it challenging. We deal with uncertainty all the time in the Intel community, but when looking at this problem, which is incredibly complex, we have to have a better understanding of what those underlying variables are so that we have some better level of predictability within that gray zone. And that's going to require a lot of work for the community itself.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Birch, and thank you everyone for attending. I think we have about 13 minutes left for questions, if any.
And please feel free to come off on mic or put it in the chat. Happy to entertain any questions if you have any.
Right now, we don't have any, but thank you so much for your presentation. And yeah, we'll be waiting for your comments, please.
Thank you, Mauricio. Let's see. Eddie, thank you. Good to see you. Thank you, Dr. Watts.
I guess, Mauricio, it's up to you for how long you want to keep this open.
Yes, so we have more 15 more minutes even, but we can wait and yeah, to receive some comments and answers.
Yeah, we have a question from Cheryl.
Beautiful. So yeah, we can go ahead. We have plenty of time. Yeah.
Cheryl, thank you for posing that question, and that's where this problem gets squishy. You see a lot of what I'd like to say is big hand waves and platitudes. As you look at I mentioned early on the Biden administration strategic framework for space diplomacy, and it says all the right things. It's a great document. It talks about how we need to improve cooperation and to really establish a set of norms for the space community. It also identifies China and Russia specifically as two nation states that are trying to basically usurp that status quo. One of my concerns, and you heard me talk about it, is that our dependency on space is much greater than China's. So we're much more exposed to it. And as we saw in the 2007 launch, there was very little indication that they were going to launch and actually do it. And they've still never fully explained what the reasoning behind that. So to answer your question is, how can the United States combat a threat from China regarding ASAT test? That really is the question. And that is not something that I think the US intelligence community and its allies are comfortable with, because we really don't know where that fits within Chinese national doctrine, and let's say the use of weapons, or the use of these types of weapons, and let's say a road to conflict. So that is really the question, and that's the big question mark. Cheryl, does that give you additional insight into some of the challenges that we're looking at? Okay, and feel free to hit me up offline. If you wanted to have that conversation, I'd love to have it with you. I guess that's the second part of this whole effort. Is we were putting the conference slides together, we have to finish up our assessment on this case, and that's one of those questions that we need to address for sure. No, thank you. Any other thoughts or views? I will say, if anybody does have any concluding thoughts or wishes to reach out to me, I've put my email there. Andrea, if you want to put yours as well, I mean, we'd be happy to have that conversation with you. Not hearing anything else, if there are none, Mauricio, we'll come back to you to go ahead and close this out. But I want to thank everyone for giving us your attention as we walk through a very complex problem. Thank you.
Thanks to you. It was a wonderful presentation. I'm sure some of our attendees will write you emails to expand the conversation. Thanks to all of you to join us in this panel on anti-satellite testing and a whole new era in spacefaring. And we hope you join the Space Education and Strategic Application Conference 2023 tomorrow in this same platform. So enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.